The sound arrives before the men do. A woman pauses beneath the weak glow of a gas lamp, listening. At first it's difficult to place. Not footsteps, not wheels, something harsher. Wooden, rhythmic. A violent clattering that tears suddenly through the narrow street and ricochets between the buildings. The effect is immediate. A window opens overhead. Somewhere nearby, a bolt is drawn back, and a figure disappears into the alleyway at speed. Another turns instinctively towards the noise, searching for its source. Then comes the light. Brief at first, a narrow beam cutting through the darkness before vanishing again behind a metal shutter. It appears once more further down the lane, sweeping across brickwork, doorways, and faces in sudden fragments. For an instant, a man standing beside a warehouse wall finds himself illuminated entirely, eyes narrowed, coat damp with mist, expression frozen between surprise and apprehension. The beam moves on. The clattering continues. Not a random noise, but a signal. A summons even. A declaration that authority is approaching through the dark. And somewhere beyond the sound and shifting light, boots strike wet cobblestones in disciplined rhythm. This was policing before radios, before whistles, before electric light. A city held together by noise, visibility, and public response. By a wooden rattle and a bullseye lantern. I'm your host, Alex Sweetman, and this is the Old Money's Cabinet of Curiosities, where we examine the inventions and artifacts that emerge when society attempts to make fear manageable and authority visible. The police rattle and the bullseye lantern were practical objects, designed less for intimidation than for function. The rattle was typically constructed from hardwood, often oak or beech, and consisted of a rotating cog housed within a wooden frame. When spun rapidly by its handle, a wooden tongue struck against teeth, producing hard, mechanical clatter, capable of carrying surprisingly far through the narrow streets and courtyards. It was not subtle, nor was it intended to be. The sound functioned as an alarm, summoning nearby constables and alerting the public that something was wrong. In an era before portable communication, the rattle transformed noise itself into infrastructure. The bullseye lantern served a quieter purpose. Usually made from darkened metal with brass fittings, the lantern incorporated a convex glass lens, the bullseye, mounted onto one side. Behind it burned a candle or oil flame, and a sliding shutter at the front allowed the constable to conceal the light until required, then suddenly project a concentrated beam into the darkness. The effect could be surprisingly dramatic. Doorways, alleyways, and faces emerged abruptly from the shadow before vanishing once more as the shutter closed. The lantern was portable enough to carry during long patrols, though not especially convenient. Oil would leak, candles guttered in poor weather, and smoke blackened the metal casing. Wind and rain constantly threatened the flame. Neither object was sophisticated by later standards, yet together they addressed two essential problems of early urban policing: how to summon assistance, and how to make the unseen briefly visible. To understand why these objects mattered, one must first understand the condition of London before professional policing existed. Prior to 1829, the city possessed no unified police force. Responsibility for maintaining order rested with a fragmented mixture of parish constables, watchmen, and local patrols, whose effectiveness varied enormously between districts. Many watchmen were elderly men, employed to patrol slowly through the streets at night, carrying staffs and lanterns while announcing the hours in a very ritualistic fashion. Serious crime often depended less upon organised intervention than communal reaction. A cry of "Stop thief!" might trigger a pursuit by nearby residents. Bells could be rung, and neighbours might gather spontaneously to confront the disorder. It was a system rooted in visibility and public participation rather than professional enforcement. But London was changing rapidly. Industrial expansion and population growth transformed the city into something increasingly difficult to monitor informally. Crowded districts, expanding slums, rising mobility, and sensationalised crime reporting all created the impression of a metropolis slipping beyond traditional systems of control. Newspapers amplified this anxiety continuously. Reports of robbery, violence, prostitution, drunkenness, and organised theft all circulated widely through the early 19th century. Whether crime itself was increasing as dramatically as many feared remains debated by historians, but public perception unquestionably hardened. London increasingly appeared to be dangerous after dark, and beneath these fears lay political unease as well. Britain remained deeply suspicious of standing police forces, particularly those that resembled the armed gendarmeries operating elsewhere in Europe. To many critics, centralised policing suggested state surveillance, continental authoritarianism, and the erosion of English liberties. This tension shaped the creation of the Metropolitan Police under Robert Peel in 1829. The challenge was not merely practical, it was psychological. The new force needed to appear effective without seeming militarised. This explains the remarkable restraint of early police equipment. Officers wore dark blue rather than military red. They carried rattles and lanterns rather than muskets and sabres, and their authority relied heavily upon visibility, discipline, and public cooperation rather than overt force. The rattle fit naturally into older traditions of communal alarm, and the lantern addressed the practical realities of poorly lit streets where gaslight remained uneven and many alleyways disappeared entirely into shadow. Together, the objects embodied a transitional philosophy of policing, one that sought to insert permanent authority into public life gradually, carefully, and with minimal resemblance to an occupying force. At the most practical level, the police rattle and bullseye lantern existed because cities after dark were profoundly difficult places to govern. Night transformed London. Gaslighting remained inconsistent throughout much of the early 19th century. Main roads and wealthier districts might receive illumination, but side streets, alleys, courts, and poorer neighbourhoods often remained in deep shadow. Visibility collapsed quickly beyond the pools of lamplight, and in such conditions, communication became a problem. A constable confronting violence or theft couldn't rely on rapid reinforcements. There were no telephones, radios, or central dispatch systems. Assistance depended entirely upon making oneself heard. The rattle solved this through brute simplicity. Its harsh mechanical clatter travelled efficiently through the dense urban streets, particularly at night when ordinary activity was diminished. The sound carried urgency without requiring specific explanation. Residents recognised immediately that something was afoot. The lantern addressed the other problem: darkness itself. The bullseye lens allowed officers to control visibility selectively, revealing faces or movements suddenly, while preserving their own night vision between uses. The shutter mattered almost as much as the light itself. Illumination could be withheld, directed, or revealed strategically. Practical function alone doesn't explain why these objects became so symbolically important, however. The early 19th century witnessed growing uncertainty about public order itself. Industrial cities concentrated strangers together on an unprecedented scale. Urban anonymity created unease among the middle classes, who increasingly feared what could not easily be seen or predicted within the rapidly expanding populations. Policing, therefore, became as much about reassurance as it did about enforcement. The constable's visible patrol suggested that order persisted even in the darkness. The lantern implied observation. The rattle implied response. And together, they projected the comforting idea that the city remained governed. This mattered politically. Britain's ruling classes feared disorder, certainly, but they also feared concentrated state power. The Metropolitan Police therefore occupied a delicate position at the beginning. Officers needed authority, but they needed to not appear oppressive. Visibility without militarism. The modesty of the equipment they chose helped to achieve this balance. A wooden rattle doesn't resemble battlefield equipment, and a lantern suggests vigilance rather than domination. These were objects associated with watchfulness and public duty rather than coercion. The distinction was deliberate. There was also an important psychological dimension to the lantern itself. Light carries a form of authority almost instinctively. To illuminate something is to claim temporary control over it, to inspect, identify, interrupt, or expose. In darkened streets, the sudden appearance of directed light altered behaviour immediately. Suspicion became visible, faces could no longer remain anonymous quite as comfortably. The lantern transformed uncertainty into observation. Meanwhile, the rattle externalised fear communally. Its sound announced not just danger, but the expectation of collective response. Neighbours might emerge, other officers would likely converge. The noise itself created a social presence and visibility around criminal activity. In this sense, both tools relied heavily upon public participation. The early Metropolitan Police lacked the manpower to dominate London through force alone. Their effectiveness depended partly on cultivating habits of cooperation and recognition among civilians. The rattle and lantern therefore functioned not simply as equipment, but as performances of legitimacy, audible authority, visible vigilance. And beneath both objects lay the broader Victorian belief that increasingly shaped public life. Uncertainty could be managed through systems, through organisation, through disciplined observation extending gradually into every corner of the modern city. The police rattle and bullseye lantern were not the creations of singular inventors, so much as products of administrative philosophy, practical craftsmanship, and gradual institutional refinement. At the centre of our story stands Robert Peel, the Home Secretary responsible for establishing the Metropolitan Police in 1829. Peel didn't personally design police equipment, but his influence shaped the principles governing its selection. The new force needed to appear disciplined yet restrained, civilian rather than military. Equipment therefore became politically significant. Too much force would alarm the public, too little would undermine their authority. Many practical decisions fell instead to the first Metropolitan Police Commissioners, Charles Rowan and Richard Mayne. Rowan, a former military officer, brought organisational discipline. Mayne contributed legal and administrative experience. Together, they translated Peel's political vision into operational reality. The equipment issued to constables reflected the balance carefully. The rattle itself predated professional policing considerably. Versions had long been in use by parish watchmen and local constables throughout Britain as regular early alarm devices. Their construction was straightforward enough that no single inventor dominates their history. Instead, they were typically crafted by local woodworkers or small-scale instrument makers. Rattles were durable rather than elegant, and surviving examples suggest hardwood construction with reinforced handles, designed for repeated patrol use. Some bore parish markings or early police identifiers as policing gradually was standardised. Their simplicity as a whole proved advantageous. Rattles rarely malfunctioned. They required no fuel, little maintenance, and minimal technical knowledge. In crowded cities, their harsh mechanical sound would cut effectively throughout the urban noise. The bullseye lantern emerged from a broader tradition of portable lighting technologies being used by coachmen, sailors, watchmen, and tradesmen throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Its defining feature, that convex bullseye lens, allowed for the lantern makers to focus and intensify light directionally rather than dispersing it broadly. This transformed a rather modest flame into a surprisingly concentrated beam. Numerous lantern makers across Britain produced variations of this design, though most individual craftsmen remain historically obscure. Their work reflects the practical ingenuity the characteristics of Victorian toolmaking: functional, durable, and quietly sophisticated. The sliding shutter represented a particularly important refinement to the original lantern designs. Constables could patrol without continuously advertising their position. They could preserve their night vision while controlling when illumination occurred. The sudden opening of the shutter created moments of abrupt visibility, which is highly effective during inspections or confrontations. Importantly, these objects existed within an emerging economic ecosystem surrounding policing itself. As the Metropolitan Police expanded, demand for standardised uniforms, lanterns, rattles, truncheons, and administrative equipment grew naturally alongside it. Contractors and manufacturers increasingly supplied police forces systematically rather than through local improvisation. Policing became infrastructure, and infrastructure naturally generates industry. Reports from early officers consistently emphasised the importance of signalling and visibility during their nighttime patrols. Practical experience shaped refinements over time, and eventually whistles would come to replace rattles during the late 19th century because they proved lighter, more portable, and more distinctive acoustically. Lantern technology also evolved as fuel systems improved over time. Eventually, electrification transformed urban lighting entirely. That original pairing remained symbolically powerful because it captured the earliest philosophy of modern British policing: authority announced through sound and asserted through light. Naturally, the police rattle declined gradually rather than dramatically. By the late 19th century, whistles increasingly replaced it throughout British policing. They were smaller, lighter, easier to carry, and capable of producing sharper, more distinctive sounds over greater distances. The mechanical clatter that once echoed through London's streets became almost antiquated in its sound, beside the cleaner precision of the whistle. The Bullseye lantern survived longer, though changing technology steadily diminished its importance. Gaslighting expanded across urban areas, streets became more consistently illuminated, and later improvements in portable lamps and eventually even electric torches rendered candle and oil lanterns increasingly impractical for police work. Technological redundancy alone doesn't fully explain their fall from use. The broader philosophy of policing evolved at the same time. The early Metropolitan Police had relied heavily on visibility, public reassurance, and restrained symbolism because its legitimacy remained uncertain. But by the late Victorian period, policing had become institutionalised far more firmly within British public life. The constables no longer needed to appear quite so cautiously civilian. Their authority had stabilised its perception as a benefit to the local population. The rattle and lantern therefore drifted gradually from useful and practical equipment into historical symbolism. They survived ceremonially, theatrically, and nostalgically, objects associated with an earlier London of fog, gaslight, and foot patrols. What disappeared wasn't merely the technology, but the fear surrounding the very idea of police presence in public life. The police rattle and bullseye lantern reveal something surprisingly delicate about the origins of modern authority. It's tempting to imagine policing as something imposed, fully formed, uniformed, confident, unquestioned, but the early Metropolitan Police emerged cautiously into a society deeply uncertain about what state authority should look like among civilians. That uncertainty shaped everything, even the objects that the officers carried. The rattle and lantern weren't designed primarily to overpower, they were designed to signal, to reassure, to make their authority audible and visible without putting the fear of that militarisation into the local population. In that sense, the equipment reflects a society negotiating its relationship with surveillance and public order long before those words acquired modern political weight. The lantern is particularly revealing. Light has always carried that symbolic power beyond simple visibility. To illuminate something is to expose it, to inspect it, and to pull back the veil on what was previously hidden. The constable's beam moving across a darkened alleyway was therefore more than just practical illumination. It represented the expanding reach of organised observation into urban life itself. The Rattle did what it had always done. It transformed private danger into communal awareness. The sound demanded attention from anyone nearby. Crime ceased being isolated the moment that clatter began. The alarm pulled the surrounding city briefly into participation, whether they wanted it or not. And that instinct remains familiar even now. Societies continue to seek reassurance through visible systems of vigilance. Patrols, signals, lights, uniforms, cameras. Each promises a little bit that uncertainty is being monitored somewhere by someone. That's why these modest objects remain strangely compelling. Not because of their craftsmanship alone, but because they belong to that moment that modern public authority first learned it must do more than just enforce in order to bring about order. With that, we close the Cabinet of Curiosities until next time. Thank you, as ever, for joining me in this gallery of invention and unease. If tonight's journey through the darkened streets of early Victorian London has held your attention, do consider subscribing, or perhaps sharing the programme with a fellow traveller of history's stranger corridors. These objects rarely disappear entirely. They echo quietly through the institutions that replaced them. As always, I remain your faithful guide. Farewell.